ensuring that every sentence is followed by a line break to make it easier to read and pace during recording. In 1944, as the smoke cleared over a shattered Europe, 730 officials from 44 different countries checked into a secluded mountain resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They were there to perform a feat of economic alchemy, constructing a global monetary order from the ground up. In just 3 weeks, these men dictated the future of international commerce, debt, and power. Most people today couldn't pick Bretton Woods out on a map yet. The rules written in those hallways still dictate the value of the money in your pocket. This was the moment America secured a double victory, conquering its enemies on the battlefield, and then more quietly conquering the global ledger. At the economic of fallen empires, we pull back the curtain on these hidden foundations. Today, I'm going to walk you through how this financial fortress was built, the desperate measures taken to keep it from crumbling, and the seismic shift occurring as the world finally looks for an exit. To grasp the magnitude of Bretton Woods, you have to visualize the absolute desolation of the mid-1940s. The old world was effectively dead. Great Britain, the planet's financial heartbeat for 2 centuries, was drowning in debt. France was a shell of itself. Germany was a graveyard of bricks, and Japan was on the brink of nuclear catastrophe. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had sacrificed tens of millions of people and its industrial core to the war effort. Then there was the United States. No bombs had fallen on American soil, and no factories had been reduced to ash. In fact, American industry had spent 4 years accelerating to a breakneck pace, outproducing the rest of the world combined. By 1944, the U.S. was responsible for half of the entire planet's economic output. It held 2/3 of all the gold on Earth and commanded a military force without historical precedent. When the negotiations began, the power dynamic was lopsided. The British sent their most brilliant mind, John Maynard Keynes, who proposed a sophisticated neutral global currency called the Bancor. It was a visionary idea, a system where no single nation held the steering wheel. The Americans, led by Harry Dexter White, killed it instantly. Why settle for a fair game when you own the stadium? White's counter-proposal was blunt. The U.S. dollar would be the sun, and every other currency would be a planet orbiting it. The dollar was fixed to gold at $35 an ounce, and every other nation fixed their exchange rates to the dollar. It made the greenback as good as gold, but more convenient to move. Keynes warned that this arrangement gave Washington an exorbitant privilege. It meant America could spend more than it earned print money to cover its tracks and force the rest of the world to subsidize its lifestyle. With no other lifelines available, the world signed on the dotted line. For a quarter century, this arrangement fueled a golden age of growth. But a hidden rot known as the Triffin dilemma was eating at the pillars. For the global economy to grow, the world needed more dollars. For the world to get more dollars, America had to run massive deficits, spending more abroad than it took in. Eventually, the math stopped working. By the late 60s, the U.S. was printing mountains of cash to fund both the Vietnam War and massive social programs. Foreign leaders, particularly Francis Charles de Gaulle, grew suspicious. He realized there were far more paper dollars in circulation than there was gold in American vaults to back them up. When France sent its navy to literally ship its gold back home, a bank run on the U.S. Treasury began. By 1971, the facade collapsed. On August 15th, Richard Nixon went on national television and unilaterally tore up the Bretton Woods Agreement, ending the dollar as linked to gold forever. A dollar should have died that night. Without gold, it was just ink and paper, but American strategists led by Henry Kissinger found a replacement more vital than any yellow metal: black gold. In the wake of the 1973 oil crisis, the U.S. struck a clandestine deal with Saudi Arabia. The terms were simple. The House of Saud would price all its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars and reinvest its excess profits into American debt. In exchange, the U.S. military would become the personal bodyguard of the Saudi monarchy. This birthed the petrodollar system. Now, if you wanted to keep the lights on or move a tank in any country on Earth, you had to acquire U.S. dollars first. This transition is a core focus here at the Economic of Fallen Empires, because it explains how the U.S. maintained its hegemony through energy rather than equity. This system created a closed loop of immense power. Global demand for oil became a permanent floor for the dollar's value. It allowed America to borrow trillions at rock bottom. Interest rates, because every central bank on the planet needed to hold U.S. treasuries as a reserve. For developing nations, however, this was a velvet-lined trap. To buy energy, they had to export real goods to America in exchange for paper or borrow dollars from Western banks. When American interest rates rose, these poor nations often spiraled into bankruptcy, forced to accept harsh conditions from the IMF. It was a cycle of dependency that lasted 50 years. But today, that cycle is fracturing. The de-dollarization movement isn't a myth or a sudden explosion. It is a slow, deliberate dismantling of the 1944 architecture. A catalyst for this shift was the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, when the U.S. froze $300 billion in Russian sovereign reserves. It sent a shockwave through every non-aligned capital city. The message was clear. Your savings are only yours as long as you stay in Washington's good graces. China, seeing its own trillions in reserves as a liability, began a frantic search for alternatives. We are now seeing a three-pronged assault on the dollar's crown. First, the rise of independent payment systems like China's SEEPs to bypass the Western-controlled SWIFT network. Second, a surge in bilateral trade, where nations like India, Russia, and Brazil trade in their own currencies. Third, a global gold rush by central banks, seeking an asset that can't be turned off by a politician in D.C. Even Saudi Arabia has signaled an openness to accepting other currencies for oil, a move that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. We aren't heading toward a sudden doomsday where the dollar hits zero tomorrow. Instead, we are entering an era of fragmentation. The world is moving from a single unified financial operating system to a series of competing regional ones. For the average American, this means the exorbitant privilege is expiring. As global demand for the dollar softens, the cost of importing goods will rise, and the ability to fund massive national debt will diminish. The world is making other arrangements, and the silence from our leaders regarding what comes next is deafening. Understanding these shifts is the only way to navigate the coming decades. If you want to track the pulse of this transition and see how the giants of the past inform the collapses of the future, make sure to stay tuned to the Economic of Fallen Empires.